The door of the dusty Crown Theater swung open so hard it cracked against the frame, and every man in the crowded entryway turned at once. He stood there in the last light of a dying Kansas sun, 6 feet 2 inches of iron-nerved Texas Ranger, trail dust still rising from his coat like smoke from a spent cartridge. His badge caught what little gold remained in the sky. His jaw was set. His gray eyes moved across the crowd with the cold precision of a man who had learned long ago that hesitation cost lives. And in the doorway beside him, her wrist barely touching his forearm, stood Harriet Zane. She was shaking, not visibly, not in a way that any of the men pressing forward could see. But he could feel it through the fabric of his sleeve, that fine tremor that ran from her hand into his arm like a telegraph wire carrying bad news. She had been shaking since the moment he had found her 20 minutes ago in the alley behind the Mercantile, cornered by 2 of Declan Rourke's hired men and breathing in short, terrified bursts that she was too proud to let anyone hear. Now the men at the stage door were looking at her. All of them. The way men looked at a woman they thought they had a claim on, like she was something owed to them, like she was property that had wandered off a fence. There were 6 of them, and one of them was Frank Udell, Rourke's chief enforcer, a man built like a grain silo and twice as empty inside. Udell stepped forward first, his lip curling, his hand moving toward Harriet with the slow confidence of a man who had never once been stopped. Galen Quaid moved his body in front of her. 1 step, smooth and final. He did not draw his weapon. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Frank Udell and at every single man lined up behind him, and he said, in a tone that carried the absolute weight of a man who meant every syllable, "She is with me." The words fell into the entryway like a stone into still water, sending ripples through every man standing there. Udell blinked. His hand stopped moving. The air held itself. That was the moment. That single sentence spoken at a stage door in Caldwell, Kansas in the autumn of 1878 was the moment that changed everything for both of them. Not the gunfight that came 3 days later, not the trial, not the morning when Harriet finally told him the whole truth about who she was and why Declan Rourke wanted her silenced so desperately that he had sent men across 2 states to find her. That moment at the stage door was where it began. But the story, the real story, had started 6 days earlier on a train platform in Wichita, Kansas, when a woman traveling alone had made the mistake of asking the wrong man for directions. Harriet Zane was 24 years old, and she had been running for 43 days. She had packed 1 leather traveling bag, her notebook, a change of clothes, and the thing that made all of this dangerous, the thing she never let out of her sight for a single moment. She had sewn it into the lining of her coat. A folded document, 3 pages long, bearing the witnessed signature of a federal land commissioner and detailing, in precise legal language, the fraudulent transfer of 11,000 acres of Cherokee land in Indian Territory to a holding company secretly owned by Declan Rourke. Harriet was a journalist. She worked for the Wichita Tribune, or she had until her editor, a pale, sweating man named Gerald Finch, had called her into his office 44 days ago and told her that the story she had spent 4 months investigating was being killed. Not delayed, killed, buried. And that she was being let go, effective immediately, with a letter of reference he clearly did not intend to write. She had understood, in the way that smart women understand things they are not supposed to know, that someone had gotten to Finch. She had taken her notes. She had taken the document, which she had obtained through means that were legally ambiguous but morally absolute, and she had left Wichita the following morning on the first train headed anywhere. She had moved between towns like a woman trying to shake a shadow. Abilene, Ellsworth. A 3-day layover in Dodge City, where she had watched the door of her rented room every night and slept in 30-minute intervals. Then east toward Caldwell, which sat on the very edge of the Kansas border with Indian Territory, a town rough enough at its edges that a woman could disappear into the crowd, or so she had hoped. She had not known that Declan Rourke's network extended this far south. She had not known that Rourke had a man at the Wichita train station, or that that man had telegraphed ahead to Caldwell. She had not known any of these things when she stepped off the train at Caldwell on a Wednesday afternoon in October and walked directly into the narrow space between trouble and worse trouble. Galen Quaid had been in Caldwell for 8 days by the time Harriet arrived. He was not there by accident, either. He was there on assignment from the Texas Ranger Company headquarters in Austin, working in cooperation with the Federal Marshal's Office in Topeka on what his commanding officer, Captain Everett Shane, had described in a written directive as a complex matter of land fraud and federal treaty violations originating in Indian Territory. Galen was 31 years old. He had been a ranger for 9 years, the last 3 working primarily on cases that crossed state and territorial lines, cases that required patience and intelligence more than the ability to shoot fast, though he could do that too, and well. He was lean and weathered in the way that men who spent most of their lives outdoors became weathered, not worn out but refined, like wood that had been worked smooth by the elements. His dark hair was cut short. His beard was kept neat. He had a scar below his left ear that he had stopped telling the story about because the truth of it was boring. A fence post. He had walked into a fence post in the dark in 1873 and it had required 4 stitches. He had a reputation for being precise, methodical, relentlessly fair. Other rangers called him the ledger because he kept accounts in his head and he balanced them before he acted. He had a reputation for never raising his voice, which men who did not know him read as calm and men who did know him understood was something more complicated. Something closer to the quiet that preceded a verdict. He had also been alone for a very long time. He had not planned it that way. He had, at 26, believed with the particular confidence of a young man that he was soon to be married, that his life would take the shape that most lives took. A wife, a home, eventually children, a table to come back to at the end of whatever case had kept him away. The woman he had planned to marry was named Clara, and she had been warm and bright and practical in all the ways that he was not. And she had waited 2 years before she had finally written him the letter that said she could not wait any longer, that she had met someone who was actually present, that she was sorry, that she hoped he found what he was looking for. He had folded that letter and put it in the inside pocket of his coat and carried it for 6 months before he took it out one night beside a campfire in the hill country north of San Antonio and burned it without reading it again. Not from anger. From a kind of acceptance that had arrived late and arrived hard, like a winter that should have come in November and finally showed up in February. He had not seriously considered another woman since. In Caldwell, Galen had been working to establish a connection between the local operations of a man named Declan Rourke, who ran a business empire out of a 3-story building on the main street of town, and the fraudulent land transfers that federal investigators in Washington had been trying to trace for 2 years. Rourke was charming, well-dressed, politically connected, and absolutely ruthless beneath all of it. He had 3 lawyers, 2 county officials in his pocket, and enough hired muscle to make approaching him directly both impractical and stupid. Galen had been building a case the methodical way. Town records, conversations with people who worked the edges of Rourke's operation, careful observation. He was close, He knew he was close, but close was not enough. Close did not hold up in a federal courtroom. He first saw Harriet Zane at the Caldwell train station on a Wednesday afternoon. She was standing at the luggage counter with one bag, and a look of absolute controlled alertness that told him, in the language of a man trained to read people in exactly this way, that she was not a casual traveler. She was watching the exits. Her bag was held against her side, in a way that suggested she was not planning to put it down. Her eyes moved in a pattern: door, window, street, door again. That was either the behavior of someone trained in self-preservation, or someone who had learned very recently and very painfully that she needed to be. He noticed her. He did not approach her. He was not a man who approached women in train stations. He had a case to work, and a careful, constructed distance from the rest of the world that had served him well enough for long enough that he had stopped questioning it. But he noticed her. The next morning he saw her again at the post office, and again that evening through the window of the town's only decent restaurant, where she sat alone with a cup of coffee and a small leather notebook, and wrote in it with a focus so intense that she seemed to have forgotten where she was, which he noted was the one time since he had seen her that she was not scanning exits. Whatever she was writing was important enough to override her survival instincts. He filed this information in the methodical way he filed everything. On the third day, he saw her speaking to a man outside the land office, and he recognized the man. His name was Coulson Pratt, and Coulson Pratt worked for Declan Rourke. Not as an enforcer, that was Udell's territory, but as a kind of administrator, a man who arranged things, handled contracts, smoothed over difficulties with cash and persuasion before they required harder solutions. Seeing Pratt approach a woman who arrived alone by train and immediately exhibited the behavioral markers of someone under a serious threat was, in the ledger Galen kept in his head, extremely significant. He began watching her more deliberately, not in a way that felt good. He was aware that there was something uncomfortable about surveilling a woman who was clearly already afraid of being watched. He justified it to himself with the logic of the case. She might have information. She might be connected to Rourke in ways he had not yet understood. She might be a witness. All of which was true. None of which was the whole truth of why he walked past the newspaper office 3 times on Thursday morning at varying intervals to confirm she was inside. On Thursday afternoon, he saw Coulson Pratt leave Rourke's building with 2 other men and head in the direction of the newspaper office. He recognized the 2 other men as associates of Frank Udell. He moved faster than he had moved in months. He came around the back of the newspaper office through the narrow passage between buildings and found the alley behind the mercantile, which connected to the alley behind the press, and found Harriet Zane there with her back against a wooden wall and 2 of Rourke's men standing close enough to her that the threat was unmistakable and specific. She was not crying. He registered this immediately. Her chin was up. Her eyes were bright and hard with anger under the fear, and she was holding her bag against her chest with both arms as though she would fight for it if she had to. He said, clearly and calmly, "Afternoon. Is there a problem here?" Both men turned. He let them see his badge. He watched the calculation happen behind their eyes. One of them, the shorter one with a red kerchief, said, "No problem. We were just talking." "Talking is done," Galen said. "Walk away." They walked away, because despite everything Rourke controlled in this town, a Texas Rangers badge in 1878 still carried enough federal weight to make men like these calculate their odds carefully. They would report back to Rourke. They would return with more men or a different approach. But in that moment they walked. Galen turned to Harriet. She was breathing carefully, measuring it, getting herself back under control with the focused precision of a woman who had been doing this for some time. He said, "You are new to Caldwell," she said. "That is fairly obvious." He said, "You should not be walking through alleys alone," she said. "I was not walking through alleys alone. I was cornered in an alley by two men who followed me from the land office. There is a difference." He looked at her. She looked at him. He saw her register his badge, run the calculation, and make a decision. She said, "I need to get to the theater tonight. I have been told there is a man who attends the evening performances who may have information about Declan Rourke that I need." He said, "You are investigating Rourke." She said, "I am a journalist, or I was before he had me fired. Now I am just a woman in possession of evidence that he very badly wants destroyed." The ledger in his head turned a page and rewrote every column. He said, "I am going to need you to come with me." She said, "I do not go anywhere with men I have not been introduced to." He reached up and touched the brim of his hat. Galen Quaid, Texas Ranger, assigned by Captain Everett Shane of Company D, working in cooperation with the Federal Marshal's Office in Topeka on an investigation into Declan Rourke's land fraud activities in Indian Territory. She held his gaze for a long, assessing moment. He had the distinct and uncanny feeling of being read the way he read other people, carefully, completely, without giving anything away. She said, "Harriet Zane, former journalist, Wichita Tribune. I have 3 pages of documented evidence that Declan Rourke fraudulently transferred 11,000 acres of Cherokee land in Indian Territory to a shell company he controls. I obtained those documents from a federal land commissioner who is now, I was told last week, no longer alive." The weight of that last sentence landed between them with the force of something that changed the shape of everything. Galen said, quietly, "How long have you been running?" she said. 43 days. Something in him shifted then. He had been doing this long enough to know the difference between a witness and a source and a victim. And he had been doing it long enough to know that sometimes a person was all 3 at once, and that the third category was the one that required the most careful handling, because those people had already paid a cost that the law had not yet acknowledged. He said, "Come with me. I have a room at the Cattlemen's Hotel. You can tell me everything from the beginning, and I can tell you what I know, and we can figure out together what to do next," she said. "And why would I trust you?" He said, "Because right now, I am the only person standing between you and the men Rourke sent to get what you are carrying, and you know that already or you would not still be standing here." A pause. The alley was quiet. Somewhere on the main street a horse stamped its feet. She said, "The theater tonight. I still need to go. There is a man named William Astor who attends the Friday evening performances. He was the surveyor on 3 of the land transfers I have documented. He is the living link between the paperwork and the actual ground. Without his testimony, the documents are strong but not airtight." Galen said, "I will take you to the theater tonight." She looked at him as though she was trying to find the trap in the offer. He said, "If there is a theater, I will stand at the door and make sure you can get in and get out safely." "No one will bother you," she said. "You cannot just stand at the door of a theater and make a promise like that." He said, "Watch me." They went to his room at the Cattlemen's Hotel, which was plain and clean and had a table and 2 chairs, and they sat across from each other for 2 hours while the sun went down outside the window, and the town of Caldwell shifted from its afternoon commerce to its evening noise. She talked and he listened, and he understood, item by item, that she had done work that his entire case had been missing. She had the documentation. He had the legal framework. Together, what they had was the thing that federal prosecutors in Topeka had been waiting for. He also understood, in a way that he found deeply uncomfortable to acknowledge even in the privacy of his own mind, that she was extraordinary. Not just the work, not just the raw courage of 43 days of running with a target on her back and a notebook in her hand, still writing, still gathering, still pushing toward the story despite everything. She was extraordinary in a more essential way that he could not reduce to professional admiration without being dishonest with himself. She had a way of speaking that was direct and precise, and occasionally, unexpectedly, funny. She described her 3 days in Dodge City with a dry understatement that made him want to laugh, and he could not remember the last time he had genuinely wanted to laugh. She had strong opinions about everything, and she stated them plainly without the softening hesitations that women were generally expected to perform in 1878, and he noticed her performing none of them. She was also, beneath the directness, clearly exhausted in a way she was managing very carefully, like a lamp turned down to conserve oil. He said, "This is exactly what we needed." She said quietly, "I know," he said. "You have been carrying this alone for 6 weeks." She said, "There was no one to carry it with." He said nothing else. He understood that some facts simply needed to be acknowledged and then folded away carefully. He began, in the methodical way he did everything, to draft in his head the communique he needed to send to the federal marshal's office in Topeka as soon as possible. Harriet rewrote her notes while he drafted his thoughts. They worked in silence for a while, which he was surprised to find comfortable. Shared silence was unusual with people he had only known for 2 hours. At 7 o'clock, he stood and put on his coat and picked up his hat and said, "The theater." She looked up from her notebook and said, "You were serious about that," he said. "I am always serious about what I say." She gathered her things. She put the documents back in the lining of her coat. She straightened her collar in the reflection of the window glass, and he looked away because watching her do that felt too personal for the 43 minutes they had been acquainted. They walked to the dusty Crown Theater in the cooling dark of an October evening in Caldwell, Kansas, and the first thing Galen saw when they rounded the corner was Frank Udell and 5 other men standing at the stage entrance in a cluster that was not accidental. Udell had information. Udell had been told that a woman with something valuable was going to be at the theater tonight, and Udell had come prepared. Galen did not hesitate. He moved his body in front of Harriet. He stepped up to the stage door. He looked at Frank Udell and at every single man standing behind him and said, in the voice of a man who had made calculations and balanced ledgers and arrived at a verdict, "She is with me." Udell stared at him. The badge on Galen's chest caught the light from the lantern above the door. The 5 men behind Udell did the same calculation they always did in the presence of that badge. But this time they did it with more urgency, because Frank Udell was not known for backing down, and the question was whether Galen Quaid was the kind of man you tested. He was not. He was the kind of man who held the line after he drew it. Udell said slowly, "This is not your business, Ranger." Galen said, "She is with me. That makes it my business. And you know that, Frank, so let us not waste each other's time." Udell looked past him to Harriet. There was something in that look that Galen did not like, something specific and calculating, and he shifted his body again so that Udell's view of her was blocked. Udell said, "Rourke wants what she is carrying. That is bigger than your badge." Galen said, "Nothing is bigger than my badge." "That is what a badge is for." A long silence. The lantern above the door flickered in a passing wind. Behind Udell, men looked at each other. Udell stepped back. 1 step, and then another, and then the whole group began to move back from the door with the grudging, dangerous retreat of men who were not conceding the argument but recalculating the timing. Galen did not turn to watch them go. He watched their faces until they were out of the immediate radius, and then he turned back to Harriet. She was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read, something between shaken and fierce, and something else underneath both of those things that she pulled back from before he could name it. She said, in a voice that was very steady for a woman who had just watched 6 men retreat because of 2 words, "William Astor. Box seats on the left side. We have maybe an hour before Udell comes back with more men or a different plan," he said. "Then let us go find William Astor." The interior of the dusty Crown Theater was dim and warm, and smelled of coal oil and cedar, and the particular dry heat of too many bodies in an enclosed space. The performance was already underway. A traveling variety company from Denver doing a production of light songs and dramatic recitations that the audience of miners, cowboys, merchants, and the occasional respectable wife attended less for the art than for the social permission to be out of the house on a Friday evening. William Astor was exactly where Harriet said he would be, in the left box seats, a thick-set man of about 50 with a surveyor's permanently squinted gaze and the cautious body language of a man who knew more than was comfortable to know. Harriet slid into the seat beside him while Galen took a position where he could watch the door and see the box simultaneously. He watched her work. She leaned toward Astor and spoke quietly, and Astor's face went through 3 distinct changes in 30 seconds. Recognition, fear, and then, slowly, something that looked like the release of something long held and painfully heavy. She had a quality, he could see it even from across the theater, of making people feel that telling the truth to her was safe. That whatever they confessed to her would be handled with care and used correctly. He could see Astor talking, see him reaching into his coat and producing what appeared to be a folded document of his own, see her taking it with both hands and holding it carefully before it disappeared into the notebook she always seemed to have within reach. 25 minutes. That was all it took. She came back to where Galen was standing and said, "He has the original survey reports. He altered them under duress. He will testify to that in a federal court, and he is willing to leave Caldwell tonight to do it." Galen said, "Tonight." She said, "Rourke knows he has been talking. He gave Astor 2 days before he was afraid someone would come to silence him. That was 2 days ago." Galen looked at the theater's main door, still clear. He looked at the back exit, clear. He looked at Harriet. He made a decision. He said, "I am going to send a telegraph to the marshal in Topeka. I need a federal detail here within 48 hours to transport Astor and take custody of the evidence. Until then, we need to keep both you and Astor somewhere that Rourke's men cannot reach you." She said, "Do you have somewhere in mind?" He said, "Sheriff Tolliver in the next county over. He is one of the few men in this part of Kansas I am certain Rourke has not bought. It is a 12-mile ride." She said, "Tonight." He said, "Tonight." She took a breath. Not a wavering breath, a planning one. Then she said, "All right, I need to tell Astor." They left the dusty Crown Theater through the back, with Astor between them, moving through the October dark toward the stable where Galen's horse was boarded, and where they would need to arrange 2 additional mounts. The town was noisy enough at this hour that 3 people moving purposefully through the back streets drew no particular attention. Galen telegraphed Topeka from the station agent's office, whose agent, a thin, nervous man named Henderson, knew enough about Declan Rourke's reach to look frightened when a ranger came in after hours, but frightened enough of the badge to send the message exactly as dictated. Then the 3 of them rode south out of Caldwell in the darkness, Galen in the lead, Harriet just behind, Astor bringing up the rear and breathing audibly with the anxiety of a man doing the bravest thing he had ever done in a life that had not prepared him particularly well for bravery. The 12 miles to Keeler County took 2.5 hours in the dark. Sheriff Ben Tolliver answered his door with a shotgun. And then, when he recognized Galen, put the shotgun down and let them in and made coffee and listened to everything with the quiet, solid attention of a man who had been waiting for this particular reckoning for longer than they knew. "Rourke has had his thumb on this county for 4 years, Tolliver said over the coffee. I could not move on him without federal backing. Anything I built he would have pulled apart through the county commission. Harriet said, now you have federal backing. Tolliver looked at her with the frank appreciation of a man recognizing ability. You gathered all this yourself, she said. Not all of it, but most of it. Tolliver said, we should let you have Rourke's job when this is over. Harriet said dryly, I want my newspaper column back. That will be sufficient. Galen watched her say it and felt something in the region of his chest that he chose, for the moment, to classify as professional respect and leave there, while he focused on the practical problems directly in front of him. Astor was given the spare room. Harriet was given the sofa near the fireplace, which she accepted with the composure of a woman who had been sleeping in whatever was available for 43 days and had made her peace with it. Galen took the chair near the door, which was a tactical position and also one that allowed him to sit with his own thoughts in the firelight while the house settled into the sounds of people trying to sleep. He was not sleeping. He was thinking. He was thinking about the moment in the alley when he had first seen her, back against the wall, chin up, arms holding the bag. He was thinking about the 2 hours at the table in his room, working in a silence that felt shared rather than empty. He was thinking about the theater, and the way she had moved through the crowd with quiet authority, and the way William Astor had, within minutes, trusted her with what he had been too afraid to trust anyone with for months. He was thinking about the way she had said, simply, there was no one to carry it with. He did not let himself think further than that. He had a case to close and 2 people to protect and a federal detail to coordinate. That was what the next 48 hours required. But the thoughts were there, patient and precise, waiting in the margins of the practical like notes in a ledger that had not yet been added to the main account. At some point in the early morning hours, Harriet's breathing changed and she was asleep. He could tell by the quality of the silence, the relief in it, the particular sound of someone's body finally believing, however briefly, that it was safe. He sat in the chair by the door and kept watch and told himself not to look at her too long. He was not entirely successful. Morning came fast and cold, with a thin frost on the windows and the smell of coffee from Tolliver's kitchen. Tolliver's wife, a broad and capable woman named Ruth, had apparently been informed of the situation and responded to it with the practical generosity of someone who had been married to a sheriff long enough to accept that breakfast was occasionally a political event. They ate at the kitchen table, all 5 of them, Tolliver and Ruth, Galen, Harriet, and Astor, who was looking better in the daylight than he had the night before. The way people looked when the decision to do the right thing finally settled into their bones and stopped fighting them. After breakfast, Tolliver took Astor into the back room to go through the survey documents in detail, and Galen found himself at the kitchen table alone with Harriet, which was both completely ordinary and somehow not ordinary at all. She was writing in her notebook. She wrote the way she did everything with complete focus, the pen moving fast, her head bent over the page. She was writing what he suspected was the full story, every detail, beginning to end, the way a journalist wrote when they finally had everything they needed. He poured himself a second cup of coffee and said, "How long have you been a journalist?" She looked up from the notebook. Something about the question seemed to catch her off guard, as though she had been expecting something practical, and he had asked something personal instead. She said, 4 years. I started as a typesetter at the Tribune when I was 20. I asked to write a piece about the drought conditions in the summer of 1875, and my editor published it, and after that it just continued. He said, "The Cherokee Land Story, how did you find it?" She set her pen down. Something in her expression shifted toward the feeling she carried about the story, which was not just professional but clearly moral, clearly personal in the way that stories about injustice became personal to the people who cared enough to tell them. She said, "I was in Indian Territory the summer of '77 doing a piece about the resettlement communities. I met a Cherokee elder named Thomas Hawk who had been farming a particular piece of land for 12 years. He had a certificate. He had recorded documentation. Everything was in order. And then one morning in June he arrived at his land, and there were survey stakes in the ground that did not belong to him. And within 2 weeks he had been told through channels he did not fully understand that the land had changed owners. His family had nowhere to go. He had children." Galen said nothing. He let it sit, she said. Thomas Hawk knew something had been done to him that was profoundly wrong and profoundly deliberate, but he had no mechanism to fight it. He could not access the same legal channels. He could not get to the right offices. He came to the newspaper because he had read in someone else's story that journalists could sometimes, do what lawyers could not. She picked up her pen again and turned it between her fingers. "I promised him I would find out what happened," she said. "And then I did. And then my editor killed the story and fired me. And now here we are," he said. "Does Thomas Hawk know you are still pursuing this?" she said. "I have been trying to get word to him through a church mission near Tahlequah. I do not know if it reached him. I do not know what his situation is now." Galen said, "When this is resolved, and it will be resolved, the land transfers that were fraudulent will be subject to reversal. The federal courts have jurisdiction over treaty violations in Indian Territory." She looked at him. Her expression was very direct. She said, "You believe that will actually happen? That the land will actually go back?" He held her gaze and said, "I think it should. I think the law says it should. I will tell you honestly that the law does not always do what it should. But in this case, with proper documentation and federal jurisdiction, the odds are better than they usually are. It will require fighting. It will require people willing to fight it." She said quietly, "I will keep writing about it. Whatever happens to Rourke, the story has to be told in full." He said, "I know." She looked at him for a moment longer, and he felt again the quality of being read that he had felt in the alley, careful and complete. And whatever she found when she read him seemed to satisfy her, because she went back to her notebook and began writing again. He sat with his coffee and did not try to fill the silence, and found himself thinking that this was what it was like when two people happened to be compatible in a way that was not simple or obvious, but was real. So real it was almost structural, like two beams cut from the same timber and fitted together so well that the joint needed no additional fastening. He stopped thinking this immediately and went to find Tolliver to discuss the details of the federal detail's arrival. The detail arrived the following morning. 4 federal deputies under the command of a marshal named Gordon Hayes, who rode in with the efficient purposefulness of men who had received urgent telegraphs and acted on them correctly. Hayes shook Galen's hand and spent an hour with Harriet going through the documents, and his expression as he read shifted from professional attention to something heavier and more certain. He said when he had finished, "Miss Zane, this is the most complete documentation of this kind of fraud I have seen in 8 years in this office. You understand that you will need to provide testimony." She said, "I understand," he said. "It may be dangerous." She said, "I have been managing dangerous for 6 weeks. A courtroom is safer than an alley in Caldwell. Hayes arranged for Astor to be transported under protective custody to Topeka, and for Rourke to be arrested on federal charges within the day. There was some discussion about the mechanism of the arrest, given Rourke's political connections and his team of lawyers, but Hayes had the authority and the documentation to proceed, and he was not a man who hesitated once he had both. Galen was not part of the arresting detail. His role in the case was complete. He had provided the framework, the witness, and the documentation chain. Other men would carry the next steps forward. It was the way of the work. You built something and then you handed it to the next set of hands and trusted that the structure you had built would hold. He was standing outside Tolliver's office in the mild autumn sunshine when Harriet came out behind him. She said, "Hayes says I am free to travel. Rourke is in custody. His men will be picked up in the next 24 hours. Galen said, "That is good," she said. "I am going back to Wichita. I am going to write the story. And then I am going to send it to every paper in Kansas, and a few in Missouri and one in Chicago, because I want to make certain it cannot be killed again by any single editor." He said, "That sounds right." She stood beside him in the sunshine. She had her bag over her shoulder, the same bag she had held against her chest in the alley 3 days ago. The documents were still in the lining of her coat, though now Hayes had certified copies and the originals were in federal custody, and she was carrying photostat copies she had made at Tolliver's office using the county's photographic equipment. She said, "Galen." He looked at her. She said, "Thank you, not just for the theater or the alley or the ride to Tolliver's, for listening, for treating what I had gathered as real. There were several men along the way in the last 6 weeks who assumed I was confused or mistaken or exaggerating. You did not do that." He said the evidence was clear. Only a man who decided not to look at it could doubt it. She said, "You would be surprised how many men decide not to look." He said, "I would not be surprised at all." She smiled at that. It was a real smile, not managed or performed, and it arrived on her face with a suddenness that changed the whole quality of the morning in a way he could not properly account for within the professional taxonomy he had been using to classify everything that had happened between them in the last 72 hours. He said, before he had entirely decided to say it, "Where will you stay in Wichita?" "You have a safe place," she said. "I have a boarding house. Mrs. Elmer Croft on 4th Street. She is 70 years old and does not tolerate nonsense. I have a standing room there," he said. "Good." She said, "And you? Where do you go from here?" he said. "Topeka to finalize the case documentation, then back to Austin for my next assignment." She nodded. The distance between Austin and Wichita stretched itself out in the air between them, roughly 500 miles, and the breadth of whatever this 3-day collision had been, still unnamed, still in the process of being understood by both of them. She said, "If you ever find yourself in Wichita." He said, "I will find you if that is all right." She said, "The Tribune building on Douglas Avenue. Ask for Harriet Zane. I intend to have my column back within a month." He said, "I expect you will have it within 3 weeks." She held out her hand. He took it. They shook hands with the deliberate formality of two people who were being very careful with themselves in a public place in 1878. And he felt the warmth of her hand through his palm, like a fact he was going to carry into the next several hundred miles, with no particular plan for what to do with it. She went to the stage that would take her to the train station at Caldwell. He watched her go. She did not look back. He stood in the sunshine outside Ben Tolliver's office and watched until the stage turned the corner and was gone. And then he went inside to work on his case documentation. And the methodical part of his mind filed and sorted and organized. And another part, quieter and less practiced, held the warmth of her handshake and kept it carefully and did not file it anywhere. He was in Topeka for 11 days. The federal case against Declan Rourke assembled itself with the efficiency of something built on solid foundations, which it was. Rourke's lawyers complicated things in the way expensive lawyers complicated everything, but Hayes was good at his job, and the documentation was airtight. The Cherokee land transfers were flagged for federal review. It was not the end of that fight. Galen knew it was not the end, but it was the beginning of the end, and that was what the law could offer. He wrote 2 letters in Topeka. One to Captain Shane in Austin, the professional debrief. One to Harriet Zane at the Tribune building on Douglas Avenue in Wichita. He wrote the second letter 3 times. The first version was too formal. The second version was too much the other way, which surprised him to discover about himself. The third version was something close to honest without being impractical, and he folded it and sent it, and then spent 2 days trying not to think about whether she would write back. She wrote back in 7 days, to the Ranger Company headquarters in Topeka, which was where he had given as his address. 4 pages. The column she had written about the Rourke case had run in 7 newspapers, including one in Chicago, exactly as she had planned. Thomas Hawke's family had been contacted through the federal courts process. The land case was complex but moving. She had her column back. And at the end of 4 pages of information and analysis, and the occasional dry precision that he had already come to recognize as particularly hers, she wrote, in the last paragraph, that she had found herself thinking about the particular quality of a silence that could be comfortable rather than empty, and that this was apparently something she had not experienced frequently enough in her life to take for granted. He read that paragraph 4 times. Then he went to find Captain Shane and asked about his next assignment. Shane looked at the map on the wall and said, "There is a matter in the northern part of Indian Territory that needs addressing. Land boundaries again, actually." "You would be routing through Wichita," Galen said. "I can handle that," Shane said. "I assumed." The route through Wichita took 3 days by train from Topeka. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November. The trees had gone bare and the air had that particular quality of early winter in the plains, sharp and bright and wide open. He went to the Tribune building on Douglas Avenue. He asked for Harriet Zane. The man at the front desk looked at him with the curious alertness of someone who routinely assessed who was coming to see whom and why. He said, "She is in. I will tell her someone is here." Galen waited in the front room, which smelled of ink and paper and the particular focused energy of a place where news was made. After 2 minutes, the inner door opened and Harriet came through it. She was dressed for work. There was a streak of ink on her left hand. Her hair was pinned up in a way that suggested she had done it quickly in the morning and then forgotten about it. She looked, he thought, like someone who was entirely at home in the place where she was doing the thing she was best at, which was a quality he recognized because it was the same quality he had, he was told, when he was working a case. She stopped when she saw him. Then she smiled, the real one. She said, "You are routing through Wichita," he said, "apparently." She said, "How long?" He said, 2 days, possibly 3. She said, "I was going to eat lunch in 20 minutes. The restaurant on Lawrence Street does a decent beef stew in the winter." He said, "I have not eaten since the train." She said, "Then wait here. I have 2 things to finish and then I am yours for the afternoon." The phrase landed between them with an incidental weight that she seemed to register a half-second after she said it, because something in her expression went briefly, almost invisibly, careful. And then she went back through the inner door, and he sat in the chair by the window and watched the people walking on Douglas Avenue, and thought about how long it had been since anything had felt this specific and clear. Lunch at the restaurant on Lawrence Street was 2 hours long. She told him about the Rourke case developments. He told her about the situation in Indian Territory. They talked about the Cherokee land case, and she told him, in a voice that carried something deeply personal just beneath the surface of it, about a letter she had received from Thomas Hawke. His family was still on his land. The Federal Review was protecting them temporarily. He had written to thank her by name, and she had cried when she read the letter, and she mentioned this with a matter-of-fact brevity that said she was not embarrassed by it, but she was also not going to make it a production. He said, "You should know that your work directly enabled the Federal Review. Without your documentation, none of this would be moving." She said, "I know. I just wish moving was the same as done." He said, "It rarely is, but moving is not nothing." She looked at him across the table with the direct quality she always had, but warmer now, without the overlay of the threat assessment and the survival management that had colored everything in Caldwell. She was, he could see, a different person when she was not running. Not a softer person, that was not the right word. A fuller person, able to use more of herself, he said, because they were being honest and they had apparently silently agreed to keep doing that. "I thought about you a great deal in Topeka." She said, "I thought about you a great deal in Wichita." He said, "What did you conclude?" She said, "I concluded that it was complicated by the fact that you are based in Austin and I am based in Wichita, and that you travel constantly for work and so do I, and that I have spent 4 years building something here that I am not prepared to leave, and that you are the most immediately trustworthy person I have met in years, which is not a small thing given what the last 2 months have been like." He said, "I concluded most of the same things." She said, "And?" He said, "And I think that the distance between Wichita and wherever I happen to be at any given time is not necessarily greater than the distance I have maintained from my own life for the last several years, and that the second kind of distance is less useful than I had assumed." She was quiet for a moment, thinking this through with the precision she brought to everything. She said, "I am not someone who makes decisions slowly when the information is sufficient." He said, "Neither am I." She said, "Then we are in agreement that this is something worth pursuing." He said, "Yes, that is what we are agreeing to." She extended her hand across the table as she had outside Tolliver's office, but this time when he took it, she did not shake it. She just held it for a moment, and he held her hand. And outside the window on Lawrence Street, the November wind moved a dry leaf down the center of the road, and the city of Wichita went about its business entirely unaware that 2 people in a restaurant were making a decision that would organize the rest of their lives. He stayed in Wichita for 4 days. The assignment in Indian Territory turned out to require a slight schedule adjustment that Captain Shane communicated via telegraph, and that Galen read with the perfectly neutral expression of a man who was not surprised to find that his schedule had very slightly adjusted itself. He saw Harriet every evening. The first evening at the restaurant again. The second evening, she showed him the Tribune's archive room, which she was clearly proud of, and they went through back issues together. And she showed him the pieces she had written over 4 years with a particular pleasure he found quietly wonderful to witness. The third evening, they walked through the city in the dark with the easy pace of people who had dropped the performance of newness and were simply present with each other. On the fourth evening, she invited him to Mrs. Croft's boarding house for supper, which was significant in the way that invitations to someone's domestic space were significant in 1878, a small but deliberate statement. Mrs. Croft was exactly as Harriet had described her, 70 years old, sharp, and tolerant of nothing she regarded as nonsense. She assessed Galen with one long look over the supper table, and then spent the rest of the meal telling Harriet about the state of the vegetable garden with the total confidence of someone who had rendered her verdict and was satisfied to move on. After supper, in the front parlor while Mrs. Croft dozed in her chair near the fire, Galen told Harriet about Clara. He had not planned to tell her, but the honesty between them had a momentum that he found he respected too much to interrupt by withholding something relevant. He told it briefly, factually. The plan to marry, the 2 years, the letter, the campfire. He said that he had spent the years since in a kind of deliberate self-sufficiency that had functioned as a protection mechanism dressed up as practicality. She said, "I have done similar things." He said, "What kind?" She said, "Choosing the work over everything else." It was not entirely a choice initially, it was also necessity. A woman in a newspaper in 1874 had to be twice as useful as any man to be allowed in the room. But it became, I think, also a way of not needing anything that could be taken away. He said, "Yes, exactly that," she said. "It is very sensible and also somewhat lonely." He said, "It is extremely lonely. I have been, however, slow to admit it." She looked at him with a warmth that was so undefended it was almost startling in its directness. She said, "I do not want to be that lonely anymore," he said. "Neither do I." He left Wichita on the 5th morning with an assignment to cover, and the settled feeling of a man who had made a decision and knew it was the right one, and was now prepared to organize his life accordingly. The next 8 months were a series of letters, some brief and logistical, some 4 pages long and written in the late hours of a night in a rooming house in some part of Kansas, or the Territory when the work was done, and the quiet had that particular quality that invited honesty. She wrote about the Cherokee land case, which was advancing through the federal courts with agonizing patience. She wrote about a new story she was investigating, water rights this time, another layer of the same systemic theft dressed in different paperwork. He wrote about the cases, the landscapes, the particular quality of a night on the plains when the stars were very clear, and there was nothing between a person and the size of the world. He found his way to Wichita 6 times in 8 months. Each time for 3 or 4 days. And each time the quality of their time together deepened in the way that things deepened when they were not being forced, but were simply allowed to grow at their natural rate, which was, in the case of 2 people who were both constitutionally careful and had spent years maintaining their distances, a little slow but extremely solid. In March, he kissed her for the first time. She kissed him back with a thoroughness that made it clear she had been waiting for considerably longer than he had realized, and when they separated she said, very quietly, "Finally," which made him want to laugh, and he did. She laughed too, and the sound of them laughing together in the doorway of the Tribune, building on a March night in Wichita, Kansas, was something he carried for a long time afterward as a specific kind of evidence that his life had changed, and that the change was correct. In June, Thomas Hawk's land case was decided in federal court. The fraudulent transfer was reversed. The 11,000 acres of Cherokee land, along with 8 other parcels that had been identified through the records Harriet and Astor had provided, were returned to their rightful holders through a federal court order that set a precedent the Cherokee Nation's legal representatives called significant, and that Harriet wrote about in a piece that ran in 14 newspapers, including 3 in the East. She wrote Galen a letter the night the decision was issued. It was 2 pages long, and it was the only time in 8 months of correspondence that her handwriting was not precise. It was rushed and slightly uneven, written fast in emotion. She said that Thomas Hawk had been in the courtroom and that she had shaken his hand afterward, and he had said, in English and then in Cherokee, words that she had written down phonetically and asked someone to translate. And the translation was, roughly, "You carried this when I could not." At the end of the letter she said, "I keep thinking about what you said, that moving is not the same as done, but that moving is not nothing. It turned out to be something. It turned out to be a great deal." He was in Caldwell when the letter reached him. The same Caldwell where it had started, 9 months ago, the alley, the theater, the stage door. The town had changed somewhat in 9 months. Rourke's building on the main street had new owners. Frank Udell was in a federal penitentiary in Missouri. The dusty Crown Theater still had its lantern above the stage door. He wrote back that same night, in the room at the Cattlemen's Hotel that happened to be the same room where they had sat at a table for 2 hours while she told him what she knew, and he understood what they had together. He wrote back and said that in approximately 3 weeks his current assignment would be complete, and that he had something he needed to discuss with her in person, and that this was not the kind of thing he intended to put in a letter. She wrote back to the Cattlemen's Hotel within 4 days, which meant she had replied immediately and posted it the same day. The letter was 1 paragraph long. She said, "I am free any Thursday through Sunday for the foreseeable future. If you are going to say what I think you are going to say, please do not take longer than 3 weeks. I am not a patient woman when I know what I want." He read the paragraph twice, and then allowed himself to feel, without managing it or filing it away, the full and unambiguous happiness of a man who was understood by the person he loved. He was in Wichita in 2 weeks, not 3. He proposed to her on a Sunday afternoon in Mrs. Croft's back garden, which was bare and brown in the summer heat, but still had 2 chairs and a table, and the particular quality of a place that had witnessed a great deal of ordinary life, and was entirely comfortable witnessing one more significant moment. He had not brought a ring because he wanted her to choose it, which she noted afterward was exactly the right decision, and one that told her something important about the kind of man he was. She said yes with the same direct certainty she brought to every decision she had sufficient information to make, and then she said, "I am not leaving the Tribune," and he said, "I know," and she said, "and I am not changing my name professionally," and he said, "I would not ask you to," and she said, "Then we should get a ring." They were married in Wichita in September of 1879, in the Methodist Church on Maple Street, with Captain Shane and his wife attending from Austin, Ben Tolliver and Ruth attending from Keeler County, and Mrs. Croft seated in the front row wearing a hat she had apparently been saving for something she considered sufficiently worthy. The service was short and plain and entirely sincere, and when Galen said the words he said them the way he always said things, with complete intention and without reservation. They celebrated afterward at the Lawrence Street restaurant, the one where they had first sat across a table and begun the process of deciding things. Henderson, the telegraph agent from Caldwell who happened to be visiting relatives in Wichita, showed up at the party because Ben Tolliver had run into him and told him, and he sat in the corner looking somewhat overcome by the sense of having been adjacent to history. The first years of their marriage were shaped by the particular practical architecture they had built before the wedding. She stayed in Wichita. He traveled, less than before by gradual negotiation with Captain Shane, but still regularly. He kept his base in Austin but spent increasing amounts of his time in Wichita. And by 1882, the Ranger Company had formalized an arrangement that allowed him to work cases in Kansas and Indian Territory from a home base that was not Austin, which made Captain Shane write a letter to the company director in which he described Galen as efficient in all respects and motivationally adjusted toward expedient resolution. He kept the letter and showed it to Harriet, who laughed until she had to sit down. Their house was on Cedar Street, rented initially and purchased in 1881 when Galen settled the estate of a distant uncle in Tennessee, and the resulting sum was enough for a down payment. It was a white clapboard house with a front porch and a kitchen large enough to have a table in it, and a second room that Harriet used as a study, where she wrote her columns and kept her notebooks, and maintained a filing system of case notes and clippings that eventually required a second set of shelves, and then a third. In 1880, their son was born. They named him James, after Harriet's father, who had died in 1876, and about whom she spoke with the careful precision of someone who had loved a person deeply and had not yet fully finished grieving them. James Quaid came into the world on a February morning with a volume and urgency that suggested he had opinions about things immediately and intended to express them, which his parents took as a good sign. Galen held his son for the first time in the pale morning light of the Cedar Street bedroom, and felt something so enormous and so simple that it made every complicated calculation of the past decade look like an unnecessary detour to a destination he had apparently always been heading toward. Harriet, who had worked up until 10 days before James arrived and was already thinking about the piece she intended to write about conditions in the Cherokee schools by the following month, looked at Galen holding James and had the expression of a woman who was very tired and very happy and very specifically clear about who she had married and why it was right. James grew into a child of impressive opinions and genuine curiosity, which was perhaps predictable given his parents. He could read by the time he was 4, which Harriet taught him with the same direct efficiency she brought to everything, and by 6, he was sitting in the corner of the Tribune's newsroom on Saturday mornings with a child's version of Focus that made the senior typesetter, a man named Barrett, start sneaking the boy pieces of the print type to examine, which James accepted with the gravity of someone taking his responsibilities very seriously. The Cherokee land case remained active through the early 1880s. Harriet continued to cover it. Thomas Hawk died in the spring of 1883 of natural causes on his own land with his family around him. Harriet was told by letter. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter for a long time and did not say anything. Galen came in from the porch, read her expression, and sat across from her in the way he had sat across from her on the first day in his hotel room, present and attending, not trying to fix or translate what she was feeling just there. She said finally, "He died at home." He said, "Yes." She said, "That matters. That is the whole point, that he died at home." He said, "It matters completely." She nodded. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer with the others she kept, the ones she considered permanent. And then she got up and went to her study and began to write the piece that would run in 11 newspapers, a memorial to Thomas Hawk and to the years-long legal fight that had returned his land and the land of 8 other Cherokee families, and to the system that had stolen it and the people who had decided to fight back. The piece was the best thing she had ever written. Galen read it at the kitchen table the night before it was sent to the Tribune, and he read it carefully, the way he read things, and when he finished he put it down and said, "Harriet." She said, "Yes," he said, "this is important. What you do is important. I want you to know that I understand that." She looked at him from across the kitchen, and there was something in her face that was very quiet and very complete. The look of a woman who had spent years working in a field that required her to justify her own presence, and had married a man who had never once required that of her. She said, "I know you do. That is one of the reasons I said yes," he said. "Only one of the reasons," she said. "There were several. The ledger was favorable." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I told Ben Tolliver once the morning after we arrived at his house, that I had met someone with a particular quality of attention. He asked me to describe it, and I could not properly. I have been trying to describe it for 4 years. She said, and he said, the closest I have come is this. The way you work, the way you listen, the way you see people and situations and facts, it is the same quality in every situation. You do not change how carefully you look based on whether the thing in front of you is considered important by whoever is watching. You just look that carefully at everything. She was quiet. He said, I find that, as a quality, to be the one I respect most in another person, and the one I have found, in the years since we met, to be the most important component of a life shared with someone. She got up from her chair across the kitchen and came to where he was sitting and stood beside him, and he turned toward her, and she cupped his face in her hands the way she sometimes did when she had something to say and wanted to be certain it was received properly, and she said, Galen, I love you. I have loved you since approximately the 3rd letter from Topeka, and I want you to know that there is nothing complicated about it for me. It is the clearest fact I know. He put his arms around her. He held her in the kitchen of their house on Cedar Street in Wichita, Kansas, in the spring of 1883, and felt the same thing he had felt holding James that February morning, something enormous and simple in the same moment. The thing that all the methodical distance had kept him from until a stage door in Caldwell, and a woman who would not look away. He said against her hair, I love you. I have loved you since the alley, I think, which is perhaps embarrassingly soon. She laughed, and he felt it against his chest. She said, the alley. Of course, he said, you had your chin up. You were terrified and your chin was up. She said, I was not going to let those men see me afraid. He said, I know. That is exactly when. In 1884, Harriet's 2nd pregnancy was a surprise, though a welcome one. James was 4, and had developed such a commanding personality that they had both privately wondered whether a 2nd child would have room to exist alongside him. But this turned out to be an unnecessary worry. Their daughter arrived in November, small and very quiet in a way that was nothing like James and exactly like Harriet when she was working through something complex, which made Galen suspect she was going to be formidable in ways that were currently difficult to predict. They named her Ruth, after Tolliver's wife, which delighted Ruth Tolliver so thoroughly when she was told that she baked a cake and sent it on the next stage to Wichita, arriving in reasonable condition for a cake that had traveled 30 miles. By the mid-1880s, the Ranger Company had formally established a Northern Division office in Wichita, and Galen was appointed its first section chief, which reduced his travel considerably and increased his administrative work in ways that he found less satisfying than field work, but accepted with the practical understanding that this was a fair trade for being home most evenings. Captain Shane attended the appointment ceremony and shook Galen's hand and said, with the particular dry expression of a man who had watched his best field agent fall in love and get organized, I am glad you found Wichita, Quaid. Galen said, I found it while looking for work. Shane said, the most useful things always happen that way. The Rourke prosecution had concluded in 1882 with a 12-year sentence in federal prison, which his lawyers reduced through appeals to 8, but which he served, in the end, in full. He died in 1890, in prison, of a heart condition, and Harriet did not write his obituary and did not feel she needed to. The story she had written in 1878 and its subsequent follow-up pieces had established her as the foremost investigative journalist in Kansas and one of the most significant in the western states. She received, in 1885, an invitation to write for a monthly journal in New York, which she considered for 3 days and then declined, on the grounds that New York was not where the stories were that she intended to tell, and that she was, furthermore, not prepared to relocate to a city that did not have the particular quality of the prairie in October, which she had come to regard as one of the essential textures of her life. Galen read her response to the New York Journal over her shoulder and said, "You declined on the grounds of the October prairie." She said, "I gave other reasons as well," he said, "but that was one of them." She said, "The prairie in October is a legitimate reason." He said, "I could not agree more." James, at 10, was already interested in the law in the specific way of a child who had grown up watching one parent investigate injustice and another parent address it, and who had absorbed, through the particular osmosis of childhood, the understanding that these were connected activities, and that both required precision and courage, and the willingness to look at things fully regardless of what you found. He asked Galen questions about ranger cases with an attention that made Galen think, on several occasions, that the boy was going to be dangerous when he was older, in the most useful sense of the word. Ruth, at 3, was conducting her own investigations, primarily into the contents of Harriet's study drawers and the lower shelves of the kitchen pantry, and reported her findings in a combination of English words and absolute certainty that suggested she had inherited the directness of both her parents in concentrated form. On a Friday evening in the autumn of 1887, Galen came home from the office to find Harriet on the front porch of the Cedar Street house with 2 cups of coffee, which meant she had heard him coming up the street, which meant she had been listening for him, which was a thing she did and had done for years, and that he found, every single time, specifically and completely moving. He sat in the chair beside her. She handed him the coffee. The October air was exactly what she had described to the New York Journal, clear and wide and with the particular smell of cut grass and dry wood and something that was just distance itself, the smell of space. She said, "Ben Tolliver is retiring," he said. "I heard from him last week. He is going to farm." She said, "Can he farm?" He said, "He says he can." "Ruth seems to think so." She said, "I want to write something about him." About what he did, keeping things together in Keeler County all those years. He said, "He will be embarrassed." She said, "He will survive the embarrassment. He has survived worse." They sat with their coffee in the October evening, and the street was quiet, and inside the house James was doing something that involved periodic thumping, and Ruth was talking to herself in the sustained monologue of a 3-year-old working through a problem. And the particular sound of their house settled around Galen like something physical, warm and specific and irreplaceable. He said, "Do you remember what you said to me the first time we had dinner at the Lawrence Street restaurant?" She said, "I said many things. Narrow it down." He said, "You said you had spent years choosing the work because it was something that could not be taken away, and that it had become a way of not needing anything that could be." She was quiet for a moment, thinking back to the woman she had been then, 9 years ago, 43 days running back against a wall in an alley. She said, "I remember." He said, "I think about that sometimes. About the cost of it, of being that careful for that long," she said. "And," he said, "and I am grateful beyond the ability to properly express it that you stopped being that careful, that you chose differently, that you let this be something you could need." She looked at him sideways in the October light, and her expression had the quality it got sometimes in quiet moments, the full, undefended warmth that she had stopped managing about a year into their marriage when she had apparently decided, based on sufficient evidence, that the management was no longer required. She said, "You know what stopped me?" He said, "Tell me." She said, "A man at a stage door who stood in front of 6 men and said, in a voice that did not have even a single note of uncertainty in it, that I was with him. he said. You were, she said. I was not. You had known me for 40 minutes, he said. You were. It was not a claim. It was a statement of intent. You were with me from the moment I chose to be in front of you in that alley, and I just made it official at the door. She set down her coffee and turned in her chair to look at him properly. She said, Galen, he said. Harriet, she said, I am going to say something and I want you to hear it completely, he said. I am listening. She said, there is not a single day, not one morning in 9 years of marriage, that I have woken up and not known, in the way that I know things when the evidence is completely clear, that being with you is the most correct thing in my life. And I have a very good life. I have work I love and a house I love and 2 children who are going to absolutely terrify the world in ways that are currently just beginning to be apparent. And all of it, every part of it, is organized around the fact that you are in it. And that is not something I manage or contain or protect myself from. It is just true. It is the truest fact I know, and I am a journalist, so I know what a fact is. He looked at her for a long time. The October evening moved around them. The street was quiet. He said finally, that is the most precisely worded declaration of love I have ever heard. She said, I tried 3 drafts. He laughed and she laughed, and then he reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand. And she laced her fingers through his with the practiced ease of people who had been holding hands long enough that it had become a physical language of its own, complete and fluent. Inside the house, the thumping had stopped, and Ruth's monologue had shifted to something that sounded like a song, slightly tuneless but confident. James appeared briefly at the window, looked out at his parents, assessed the situation with the expression of a 10-year-old who had developed, from close observation, a fairly accurate understanding of what his parents were like with each other, and withdrew from the window with a dignity that Galen found almost funny. Harriet said, without turning from the street, he is going to be exactly like you. Galen said, he is going to be exactly like you. She said, then he will be very good at whatever he chooses to do. He said, he will be exceptional. She said, Ruth will be exceptional in a different way. He said, completely different. She said, I think Ruth is going to be a lawyer. He said, the way she argues her case for a second piece of bread every morning, I think you are right. The evening settled into night, and they sat on the porch of the Cedar Street house until the cold made it impractical. And then they went inside to supervise the bedtime negotiations with James and Ruth, which were, as they always were, thorough and spirited, and eventually concluded in the children's favor in ways that both Galen and Harriet separately suspected, but did not entirely acknowledge. After the children were asleep, they sat at the kitchen table with tea, which was the evening ritual, the table where they talked through things, the day, the cases, the columns, the small and large architectures of a shared life. Harriet was writing notes for the Ben Tolliver piece. Galen was reviewing the administrative brief for the Northern Ranger Division's quarterly report. The lamp was warm and the kitchen smelled of the evening meal, and outside on Cedar Street, the last of the October wind moved through the trees that were just finishing their turn from green to gold. He looked up from his report and looked at her, bent over her notebook, the same notebook posture he had first seen through a restaurant window in Caldwell in 1878, before he had known anything about her except that she was paying close attention to something. He thought about the stage door. He thought about the 2 words that had started everything, or not started it, confirmed it, named something that had already begun in an alley when he had stepped between her, and the men who wanted to take from her what she had fought 43 days to protect. She looked up from her notebook and caught him looking at her and said, "What?" He said, "Nothing." She said, "You have the look." He said, "What look?" she said, "the one you get when you have thought something through to its conclusion and arrived at a verdict." He said, "The verdict is that I am the luckiest man in Wichita, Kansas." She tilted her head, assessing this. She said, "That is a modest claim. Are you not going to extend it to the state?" he said. "I did not want to oversell it." She looked at him across the table with the warm and undefended expression, the one that she had stopped managing years ago, and said, "Galen Quaid, you are the most accurately self-aware man I have ever met, except when it comes to your own happiness, at which point you become oddly conservative in your assessments. You are the luckiest man on the entire prairie," he said. "I am the luckiest man on the entire prairie," she said. "Better." She went back to her notes. He went back to his report. Together,